Okay, hello everyone and happy December. I hope you are all doing well, staying safe, and taking care of yourself, staying connected in whatever ways are possible right now. Um, it's noon, so I'm going to get started. I have some questions that have been submitted, so I'll start with those, and if anyone joins and has additional questions, I'd be happy to address those as well. All right, so the first question is, I've been wondering about two directions in my yoga classes in terms of what is good in a class for arthritis. Number one, when is it okay to use a pose with a throat opener like fish? Okay, and so let me talk about that before I get to the second part of that question. So fish pose in its traditional form, where the head is back, the back is arched, and the crown of the head is resting on the floor. I do not recommend, period. I did it in my 20s. I knew a lot less about arthritis. Looking back on it, I don't think it's smart or necessary for anyone to do that. And here's why. So if you've done my yoga for arthritis trainings, you know that some of the guidance I offer to generally think about contraindications is that you don't want to add force to a fully flexed joint or to a joint that is at the end of its range. Okay. So, an example of that I sometimes use is if you go into a twist, you're at the end of the range of your twist, as in other words, as far as your body can go in that twist. So at that point, you're reaching the limits of either, what is capable in terms of your bony physiology, like, bones are hitting each other, or you're reaching the end of your flexibility. In either case, that's as far as you can go. If you add force to that, and a way that happens in twists sometimes is to grab on and pull yourself further into that position, you're adding force to a joint that already has a lot of pressure on it. Now, in the case of a twist, it's a lot of joints because that pressure is distributed throughout the vertebral column, but it's a lot of force that you're putting on all of those discs that are in between the vertebrae. Similarly, I wouldn't advise something like shoulder stand, where you are putting essentially the entire weight of your body, because now your body is upside down, on your neck, the cervical spine, which is fully flexed. So in other words, you've gone to the end of the range of your cervical spine, your chin is on your chest, your cervical spine can't flex forward any further, and then you're adding 100 plus pounds of weight to those vertebrae that are already getting squeezed. Okay. So while it's not the full weight of the body in fish, and while it's not the force of your muscles pulling you into position, it's still putting extra force on, in this case, a fully hyperextended spine, cervical spine. So it's sort of the opposite of shoulder stand, just as problematic for the other side of the vertebrae. Okay. So when you put your skull on the mat, you're now applying pressure to the skull, which is pressing down on the cervical spine. Okay. So I don't recommend that, certainly for anybody who has arthritis, but frankly, I don't recommend it for anybody with a healthy spine either, if you want to keep it that way. That being said, there are many variations of fish that are safe, healthy, possible, and available. The contraindication for a fish that does not put the head on the floor. So you could go into fish, for example, you could put your forearms on the floor, right? Your elbows on the floor, and then go back and your head is hanging, but it's not actually touching the floor. So your head, and really this is how, like, this is why I think forearm stand is fine, even though I wouldn't do shoulder stand. I also think headstand is possible if you actually, when you do headstand, you should not have pressure on your skull in a headstand. You should be able to move your head, right? Because so your hair is touching the floor, but there is no pressure in your head and therefore no pressure on your spine. That being said, something like headstand is a lot safer than something like fish because the spine is neutral. And so you're getting pressure down an aligned spine. That's assuming that the spine is aligned. It's also assuming that the spine is healthy enough that it can handle that pressure. That's a whole other conversation. But variations on fish, which also, instead of actually holding yourself in that position by putting the forearms on the floor, you could be over a bolster. And there are lots of versions of fish poses that are supported, like a restorative fish, where you're arched over a bolster, for example. You could even do a modified version of fish where the back of the skull may be resting on the floor instead of the crown of the skull. And that would be a lot safer. I would not do any of those for people who have cervical arthritis that is irritated by those poses, or people who have rheumatoid arthritis. And I'll tell you why. And I do mention this in the trainings. Hello to those of you who have jumped in. I'm in the middle of answering a question. So there is a mutation that can happen in the context of rheumatoid arthritis or other systemic inflammatory arthritises. And I do believe I spoke about this it's December, either maybe in October, I talked about this. So C1, C2 looks sort of like this. Okay, so you have a ring that's sort of going over a protrusion, and that kind of keeps the top of your cervical spine in place. That's right below the skull. And that's what allows so much movement. Most of the movement when we turn our head is happening just at C1, C2. That protrusion in some people with inflammatory arthritis is recessed, it's eroded. And if you have that, then there's not very much holding this vertebrae in place. So if you drop the head back, it can actually harm this vertebrae, or it can also press on the spinal cord, and you can experience neuropathy as a result of that, nerve pain as a result of that. So I'd be very careful with that population, and I wouldn't drop the head back so that it's hanging back. And that's why whenever we're doing sort of back bends in a yoga for arthritis class, I talk about gazing upward toward like the seam where the wall and the ceiling meet, as opposed to dropping the head all the way back and looking up at the ceiling, because of that C1, C2 issue. Also because it's just too much hyperextension at a single vertebrae. What you want in a back bend is you want an even distribution of that hyperextension throughout the entire spine, just as the same as you want to feel that folding in cat-cow distributed throughout the entire spine. You don't want it just happening in one part of the body. Okay, so that, I hope, answers the fish question. To summarize, I wouldn't recommend that anybody do full fish with pressure on the crown of the head, especially anybody with arthritis. There are lots of variations of fish that are perfectly fine, especially those that either don't have weight in the head or are supported. In any sort of back bend, you want to be careful about too much hyperextension in the neck for those who have arthritis in the neck, or for those who have systemic inflammatory arthritis. All right, So I have a couple more questions that were sent in that I want to respond to, and then I'm happy to take questions from anybody who's here, and I see one in the chat. So I will certainly get to that. All right, next one. What about when it is okay to have a curve back, for example, in a head to knee pose, in a yogic seal, forward fold, cobra, and when do we want to maintain a straight back? Okay, so there are sort of a bunch of questions in that one question. All right, so let me talk about, let's talk about forward fold, okay? So head to knee pose, actually head to knee pose, I have a similar philosophy on this. If you're seated and you're doing a forward fold, when you're upright, the pressure of gravity is going down through an aligned spine, okay? A neutral spine, the pressure is evenly distributed if the spine is well aligned. As you tip forward, so imagine that this is the spine, okay? And the pressure is going down through the center of the spine. As you tip forward, the relationship between the spine and gravity changes, so that now some of the pressure is on the back of the spine and some of the pressure is on the top of the spine, okay? So the pressure on the discs is greatest top down because gravity is pressing on all of the discs. Now, if they're well aligned and the weight is evenly distributed, then that's fine. But if you round the spine and the pressure is coming down from the top, now you have that situation that I just talked about in the last question where you're getting force on a flexed spine. We don't want the full force of gravity on a flexed spine because in this curve, you're compressing all the fronts of the vertebrae. So you're squeezing all the fronts of the intervertebral discs. Now, if I bend, if I hinge at the hips, so imagine this is the hip, and I hinge at the hips, so now I'm more in this orientation, and now I round the spine. Well, now gravity is pressing down in this direction. And so it's not compressing the discs. Gravity is not compressing the disc. The further you tilt forward, the less gravity is pressing on the discs. So I sort of suggest, let's meet halfway. And if you've gotten to 45 degrees, you've taken half of the pressure out of the spine. And then a little rounding is going to do a lot less harm than if you're rounding when you're upright. So if you are hinging at the hips in head to knee pose, in any sort of seated forward fold, if you don't get to 45 degrees, keep your spine long. If you are able to achieve 45 degrees because you have enough flexibility in the hamstrings, low back, etc., then it's okay to release forward and allow some rounding of the spine. I say that, but I want to caution that if someone has osteoporosis in the spine, you have to be very careful about forward folding. And again, what you don't want to do is fully flex the spine. So my recommendation for osteoporosis, and this is a very controversial subject, but I do believe that some pressure on the bones is necessary in order to maintain bone strength. Bone builds in response to pressure. If you take all the pressure out, then you're going to get even further deterioration, but too much pressure and you're going to fracture. So you have to be really cautious. Another challenge about osteoporosis is you don't feel it the way that you feel arthritis. If you have a herniated disc and you're folding forward and it's pushing your disc further out, you're going to feel that and you're going to back off. And that's where pain can actually be very helpful. Osteoporosis is not that way. You could fracture and have no idea that you did it. So while I say generally speaking, 45 degrees, you can allow some curving of the spine. That is, you have to take into consideration things like bone risk. Okay, so that is different from yogic seal, because yogic seal, I don't recommend the full expression of yogic seal for this population, which is essentially the reverse of fish. So the way that I learned yogic seal, you fold forward so much that the crown of your head is on the floor. And yogic seal is a mudra. It's not an asana. It's a whole body energetic lock. And so the idea is to bring all of the energy in, to seal the energy in. It happens at the end of practice, in order to sort of seal in the benefits of the whole practice. So I believe that you can experience the energetic inward focus and honor that intent without actually achieving that physical posture. So in the full expression of a yogic seal, you reach, or you're in lotus, full lotus, right? 1 foot on the opposite thigh. You reach your arms around, you grab hold of your big toe on the opposite foot, you fold forward and you put your head on the floor. Okay. Again, something I did in my 20s, not something I would ever do in a yoga for arthritis class. But what you can do is sit in easy pose, Sukhasana, reach around and grab hold of an opposite wrist. Okay, so you're getting Sukhasana, the legs are coming in and they're folded in on each other. So you're still getting that sealing of the legs even without being in full lotus. You reach around back, you hold onto your opposite wrist, you're still getting a bind of the arms. You lower the chin down and you bring your focus inward. Okay, you could even do a lock at the upper chakra there. Okay, so instead of fully curving the entire spine, just tilting the head downward and feeling that inward focus, maybe drop the eyes down, maybe even close them and bring your awareness inward. That's what the yogic seal is about to me. So I think this full curving of the spine is not necessary to achieve the purpose of yogic seal, which is not about biomechanics at all. It's about energetics. And then there was a question about Cobra as well. So for Cobra, the hands are on the floor, and the back arches. So what I want people to think about in Cobra is an engagement of the middle and lower traps, where I think a lot of people experience weakness, especially people who have, are folding forward a lot, either over their devices or in conversation, et cetera. We tend to have a society that's a little bit forward folding or a lot forward folding. So engaging those middle and lower traps, drawing the shoulders down and engaging those middle and lower traps, drawing the shoulder blades in toward each other, and having the hands on the floor, but not pressing into the hands. So when you press up and you take your weight into your arms, you're no longer using the muscles of your back in order to hold yourself in that position. And if you're pressing up with your hands, you're more likely to overextend your spine, because you can press up a whole lot higher with your hands than you can arch using your back muscles. So I find that using the muscles of the back to rise up, you get a more modest back bend, which is going to be a healthier back bend. And you also get, I think, more benefit posturally and in terms of muscle weakness by engaging those muscles. So what I tell people to do in Cobra is test whether or not you're using your own back to hold yourself up by picking the hands up off the floor, and can you stay there? So you can have your hands resting on the floor without pressing into them. So as soon as you press into your hands, and especially if you come into something like up dog, then you have a big curve in the spine. Then I'm worried about compression in the low back, for example. So I do a lot of Cobra with my yoga for arthritis students and clients, but I don't have them pressing into upward dog. So I hope that answers that question. The next question that I have submitted in advance is, Stephanie, is there anyone out there doing a study on patients in the topic of yoga for arthritis who have pacemakers? Okay, so that's super specific. And so the short answer is no. There is definitely research on yoga for people with arthritis, which you all are aware of because I don't stop talking about it. And, you know, it's a lot of what I do myself. There also happens to be a very sparse sprinkling of literature on yoga for people who have pacemakers and defibrillators. It is possible that some of the people in the yoga for arthritis research may have pacemakers and defibrillators, but there's nothing that's been done to measure that. It's also possible that some of the people in the studies on pacemakers and defibrillators also had arthritis. In fact, that's far more likely because if you have a pacemaker or defibrillator, in general, you tend to be a little older, and most older people have some osteoarthritis. But when a study gets designed, they set outcomes, which are what are you going to measure based on what your research question is. So if I'm doing a study on yoga for people with pacemakers, what I probably want to know is it safe to the cardiovascular system? Because that's the population and that's the research question. I would not be looking at things about their joints, even if that's happening, because that's not the focus of the study. So I don't know why the person who asked this question asked it and what they're trying to get at, but you could probably take the literature on yoga for arthritis and the literature on yoga for people with pacemakers and sort of look to see where is the overlap. What I am happy to do is share, and I can do that in the chat right now, some of the studies that have been done in this population. So there is a study, a randomized controlled trial on yoga for people with, they're called ICDs, defibrillators. So I'm actually going to paste this. And I hope that the chat gets preserved in our recording. But if not, I will have to find another way to share. Okay, so that is the study, the randomized controlled trial on yoga for pacemakers. There is also, interestingly, a pilot study on MBSR for adolescents with pacemakers, which I, didn't realize that was that was common enough to study. But that second one is a pilot on MBSR. And those of you who are familiar with MBSR know that it does include some asana. So whatever it is that they noted there may be useful. I haven't read these papers. I just did a little quick search before this Q&A so that I would have something useful to provide. So those two studies may be of interest. And then while I was searching, I found this other cool stuff, which is there is a group called the Pacemaker Club. And on the website for the Pacemaker Club, there is a conversation about yoga. And so this is sort of by people who have pacemakers themselves and have thoughts about should you or shouldn't you do yoga. And spoiler alert, there are, people say both. There are some people who say, yes, I practice yoga. I have a pacemaker. Here are the things that I don't do. Here are the things that I'm careful about. And then other people say, absolutely don't do it. I think the people who say absolutely don't do it don't understand how diverse yoga practice can be. And then there is also a Facebook group for yoga practitioners with pacemakers, which I like an entire Facebook group just for that, which is super cool. So I'm also pasting into the chat a blog post that talks about the Facebook group and has a link to the Facebook group for those who are interested. So that is a whole lot of due diligence on my part to be able to respond to a question on a topic I did not have prior awareness of. I have a family member with a pacemaker defibrillator, and now I've got all sorts of information to share. Okay, now those are the questions that were submitted in advance. There's a question here in the chat. I'm hearing lots of folks falling lately in 50s to 80-year-olds. A mindfulness issue or other? Should I focus on balancing poses or stability practice? Oh, that's a great question. So yes. So why do people fall? And especially, why do older people fall? And why might older people be falling more now? And that's an anecdotal observation. I'm not saying it's definitely true that older people are falling more now. But there's some really interesting science about falls. So I have I actually, this question just came in, so I did not do my homework, but I have a paper on yoga and falls. Let's see if I can pull it up. Yoga, falls, munas. Okay, here we go. So this is a systematic review on yoga for balance, actually. And one of the things that we talk about in that paper is that there are 3 contributors to balance. There are 3 systems that are involved in balance. There is the visual system. Okay, so part of how we balance is by seeing what we can see and sort of keeping an even horizon, and keeping everything where it is, right, visually, which is why as soon as you close your eyes, it's harder to balance. And so anyone who has visual impairment is going to have some compromise to the visual component of balance. So as people get older and they start to lose their vision, then they also can have more challenges balancing. If somebody, so just bringing it to our current situation, if somebody's prescription is out of date because they haven't been going to their doctor's visits and they haven't gotten their prescription renewed, or they're not bothering to put their contacts in because they're not going out, so who cares? Or they're not wearing their glasses around the house, again, because they're not going anywhere, then they may be more likely to have compromised balance and therefore fall. The second system of balance is the proprioceptive system. And so that is the pressure of our feet on the floor, which is why if you're on a soft surface, it can be harder to balance. Like if you're standing on a rug versus standing on a hard floor. And that's one of the reasons why in a yoga class, sometimes people will step off of their mat in order to do their balancing poses on the hard floor, because you get better proprioception. It's also one of the reasons to do yoga with bare feet. You get better proprioception. If somebody has neuropathy, then they're not going to get very good proprioceptive feedback, and therefore they're less stable. So as people get older, they're more likely to have neuropathy, and therefore that's another system that can be compromised. If we're talking about our current situation, again, if someone has diabetes, if they're not doing a great job self-managing, if they're not getting themselves to their quarterly visits with their PCP, if they're not checking their glucose with their glucometer and making sure their blood sugar is well regulated, then they also may have more trouble balancing. And then the last one is vestibular, and that's the inner ear. And that's why when you have a cold, it's more difficult to balance. Why you might feel dizzy is because you have upset to your vestibular system. So anybody who, I'm going way out on a limb here, but if you're congested, right? I don't know that the symptoms of COVID would be, would upset the vestibular system, but I could see an argument for how that would happen. But also flu season, cold season, all of that. If people are congested, then their vestibular system could be out of whack. Okay, so those are the 3 balance systems that could be contributing to falls. But there was also the mention of mindfulness. Is it a mindfulness issue? And So there's like what's going on physiologically, and those three systems are all physiological, but that doesn't take into consideration the psychological component. So one aspect of the psychological component to balance, I would say, is mindfulness. If you're not paying attention, then you're more likely to fall because you didn't notice that the rug was bunched up, or you weren't, you weren't looking where you were going, or your shoes aren't tied, or, any of that stuff is mindfulness, paying attention. You're not making sure to actually pick up your feet and, use proper gait, heel strike and toe off, but you're sort of shuffling because you're not really paying attention. That could all be a mindfulness issue. And then there is fear of falling. And fear of falling is a huge component of falling itself, because people who are afraid of falling are less likely to do things and therefore more likely to get deconditioned. This is actually another reason why falls might be up, because people are doing less, especially older people who are not going out because of COVID risk. They're not doing just the routine daily activities that would normally engage their muscles to an extent, like going to the grocery store, all the errands, walking the mall, whatever it is that somebody might do in their daily life to sort of move around, even not exercise necessarily, but just physical activity during the day is way down if people are staying in their homes. And so if you're getting deconditioned, then that's another reason that you might fall. But in addition to that, who wants to fall right now? Who wants to end up in a hospital right now? Right? If you're afraid of anything happening to you because your kids aren't coming to visit and nobody would know, and you'd be, you're probably out of fear, more likely to do less. But also, here's the other part of fear of falling. If you're afraid of falling, you're actually less stable on your feet because you're walking tentatively. So you're not sure-footed. So ironically, being afraid of falling actually makes you more likely to fall in a few different ways. So all of this is yoga stuff. All of this, proprioception in our feet, right? That's body awareness, that's body scan, that's feeling our contact with, 4 corners of the foot on the floor. That's yoga. Closing the eyes and being able to stand in balancing poses without the visual contribution. That's yoga. Our strengthening our vestibular system, being able to balance when our head's not upright. That's yoga, right? So we don't just do poses like tree where we're upright, but what about King Dancer? Our head is tilted. Half moon, our head is tilted. When you balance in any of those poses, you are challenging and thereby strengthening your vestibular system. Mindfulness, paying attention to where you are, where you're going, how you're walking, all of that is yoga. And then managing our fears, our attachments and aversions, our, living in anxiety about the future rather than being fully in the present. That's yoga. So we can use the practices of yoga to address all of these very complex and diverse risks associated with and contributing to falls. All right, that was a very, really long and meandering answer to that question. I hope it was useful. Okay. All right, so I have got nothing else. So I have Diane and Charlene here. Do either of you have other questions? I'm happy to engage on any topic of your choosing. You can unmute or you can type it in the chat.
Well, I'm okay. Those were my questions. I can see this recording again, right?
Yeah, I'm recording it. Yeah. Yeah, because you came in the middle of my very long, I have really long answers to short questions. I had a very long answer to the question about fish that you came in on the tail end of. So you may want to go back and look at that part.
It was great.
Okay, good.
And yes, thank you, Stephanie. That I was the fall question. And I think in a week, I have had 3 folks tell me that they fall, and one person's in their 50s and the other 2 or like late 70s and 80s, and so it was just alarming that it was happening so much that it
Well,
seemed.
these are all, if these are private clients that you're
Yeah,
working with, then you can follow up on,
yeah,
how's your vision? Are you wearing your glasses, putting your
yes,
contacts in? Does your prescription need an
yeah,
update? Do you have diabetes? Have you gotten in for your visits? Are you
yeah,
checking your blood sugar? Those are all things like, and then you can obviously work with them on those practices, those stabilizing practices, and also the mindfulness. Like if you're going to go somewhere, if you're going to walk from your living room to your kitchen, put your phone down, pay attention to your walk from the living room to the kitchen, make that a mindfulness practice.
Well, let me just ask two things. Well, one, I think the fear of falling is a big one because they're alone,
Yes,
and
right.
it was, are you wearing your life alert? That was the other
Yes,
question.
yes.
And then the other one was someone was saying that they think that they may have vertigo and
Mm.
that they're noticing that if they do put their head back, then they feel more susceptible to falling.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
that's something that they should go to their doctor about. Well, they can do a telemedicine visit, right? So
Mhm.
they can
Yeah.
at least have a virtual consult with their doctor to do whatever assessment is possible. Um, and the doctor oftentimes can just ask some pointed questions and figure out what is likely to be going on,
Yeah.
and they end up sending them to a specialist.
Mhm.
Um, I think that unfortunately, many people, especially older people, are avoiding doctor's offices
Mhm.
because of fear of contracting COVID at the doctor's office. But by doing that, they're not getting all of their routine care and addressing other issues that are actually going to put them at greater risk of health problems
Yeah.
down the road. So, I've been encouraging everybody, the doctor's office, they're taking your temperature. Somebody who has COVID is probably not going to their doctor's office. They're going to the hospital or urgent care or whatever. So people should not avoid their routine care
Yeah.
because of fear of COVID. We're going to be at this. It's been almost a year already.
Mhm.
And so if you think about not getting preventative care in your
Mhm.
older age for over a year,
Mhm.
that concerns, from a public health perspective, that concerns me.
Yeah. Thank you. It's very helpful.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, well, if that's it, then I wish you both a very happy holiday season. It's lovely to see your smiling faces, and I hope that everyone who watches this um, finds something useful in it, and feel free to submit follow-up questions that I'd be happy to address next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.